Hi, today we're talking about fat, chapter 4. Our three macronutrients are carbohydrates, fats, and protein. These three are energy-yielding nutrients. In the last chapter, we covered carbohydrates, and today we will be talking about fat. Fat conjures up all kinds of thoughts, good, bad, decadent, naughty. But fat isn't all bad. Many people think that they should eliminate fat in their diets and that any amount of fat on their body is unhealthy. In fact, both dietary fat and body fat have many positive functions. It's important to maintain a sufficient amount of body fat as well as to consume the recommended amount of total fat in the diet. Our learning objectives for this chapter are to identify foods that are high and low in fat and how fat really is needed in the diet, not only as a nutrient but also to enhance the eating experience. We're going to talk about the different sources of fatty acids, saturated fat, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. Many people hear these terms and are not quite exactly sure what they mean, so we're going to explain those in great detail. We're going to identify sources and functions of essential fatty acids, DHA and EPA and what those mean, and also cholesterol. We'll talk a little bit about how fat is digested and absorbed and how it's supplied to the cells in the body and its functions. And we'll also discuss the difference between fat and cholesterol and what the dietary recommendations are. So we're going to get started on fat. When I think of the word fat, a lot of different things conjure up, but the technical term for the word is actually lipid. Lipids includes fats, oils, and cholesterol, and we use the word fat to refer to many things. For the purposes of our book, lipid is the chemical name for a group of compounds that includes fats. And when I think of fat, I'm referring to more of a solid product at room temperature. Oil is generally liquid at room temperature. And then there's cholesterol. And we'll talk in great detail about cholesterol today. But it's another substance that's found in food of animal products. So when we're eating food, fat is really important because it adds creaminess to foods. Think about a really rich bisque or a soup, or maybe some, ice cream, or maybe crunchiness to potato chips, or the sizzle to your steak. Fats enhances flavor and also aroma. It adds crispness to fried food, and it makes meat really juicy and tender. Think about that well-marbled ribeye. And it also helps to make baked goods very tender. And you couldn't have a delicious Indian curry without fat to carry the flavor. And it gives that wonderful mouthfeel. And you can think about a, store brand ice cream versus a premium brand. There's a big difference in how it has, what kind of mouthfeel it has. When we refer to fat in general, there are obviously no fat or little fat in foods like fruits, vegetables, beans and peas, non-fat dairy products, breads, cereals, and grains. But obviously, if you drizzled poppy seed dressing on a fruit salad, you would be adding fat. If you deep-fried vegetables or maybe dressed them with a compound butter, you would be adding fat. When you cook a pot of beans and add salt pork or sausage, you're adding saturated fat. Or maybe when you eat a croissant or cereal with nuts or coconut, you're adding fat that was not generally there. So there are a lot of foods that do not have fat. But let's look and see how they fit into different groups. So the foods that have low to no fat are things like fruits and vegetables. Now there are a few exceptions. Avocados, olives, coconuts, and bread, cereals, rice, pasta have no fat, except like I mentioned, a croissant, maybe a biscuit, cornbread, granola. Those are generally grains and cereals that have more fat added. And again, dried beans and peas generally don't have fat. The foods that are higher in fat are your fats and oils and condiments, anything that spreads, butter, margarine, mayonnaise. And then, of course, higher fat meat, poultry, and fish. Like, for instance, chicken with the skin is very high in fat. But if you remove the skin and not eat it, then, generally like a chicken breast would be low in fat. Dairy products are very high in fat if the whole milk versions are consumed. And things like cheeses are very high in fat. In fact, there is such a thing as a lower fat cheese, but there's really no fat-free cheeses because fat is really what gives cheese flavor. Things like nuts and seeds are very high in fat. So the bottom line here is it's not whether it's good or bad. It's if it's higher in fat, then you have to modify the quantity that you eat or the frequency that you eat it, or manage it in so that it's within your calorie budget. So as you can see in the slide, you can't really see some of the fat that you get in the foods that you're eating. And also, you can't really tell the mixture of saturated and unsaturated fat. So we have to review that in great detail so that you have a better understanding. In this chart, you see a listing of dairy products in calories ranging from fat-free to high fat. So obviously, anything like skim milk or non-fat yogurt is going to have very, very low to no fat. And then, of course, when you jump up there to your very high-fat foods, your butter, most of your cheeses, your whole milk. So it just kind of gives you an overview of which foods have fat and how much fat. So a low-fat food is going to have 0 to 3 grams per serving, and the serving is listed in the chart. Same thing with your very high-fat foods. Those are going to have 9 or more grams of fat per serving. In this chart, you can see which animal products are low, meaning, low in fat, and which are higher in fat. In general, seafood and chicken breasts with no skin are very low in total fat than many of your cuts of beef. Ground beef is often 20-80 or 80-20. That means that it's 20% fat by weight. Now, you can always buy leaner beef that may be 15% fat by weight, 10%, or even 5%. Now, when it comes to things like ground turkey and ground chicken, you may include the skin, and if it does, it might contain about 15% fat. With no skin, it would be about 5%. So it's very important to read the label. So the point here is that ground turkey and ground chicken may not always be a substitute for beef. Many times you might be better off getting the lower fat ground beef. Again, you can't always see most of the fat in the foods that you eat, except of course when you add oil or maybe fat in the preparation or cooking or at the table. The fat in meat, milk, cheese, and fried food is really invisible compared to butter that you spread on your bread. Most solid fats and oils contain from 12 to 15 grams of fat per tablespoon. Now let's look a little bit at the types of fat. From a chemical standpoint, fat, oil, cholesterol, and lecithin, and other compounds fall into a group called lipids. For chefs, the most important lipids are fats, which are generally solid at room temperature, and oils, which are liquid at room temperature. Cholesterol, on the other hand, is a wax-like substance found in our body and found in our food. And lecithin is a lipid compound that acts as an emulsifier. Most of the fats in foods, and that's over 90%, and also in the human body, are in the form of triglycerides. So when we talk about fat in food or in the body, we're really talking about triglycerides. A triglyceride is made up of 3 fatty acids. That's where the word tri comes into play. Tri meaning 3. A triglyceride is made of 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol, as we will see in the next slide. So again, it's really talking about the chemical makeup. A fatty acid are molecules made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. If you remember back in chemistry, C is for carbon, H is for hydrogen, and O is for oxygen. In this chapter, we talk about chemistry just so that you can understand the chemical makeup of fat, but it's not something that you will be tested on or be expected to really remember a lot of. But I think it's important to have a background just so that you can understand why fats act the way they do and how they affect our body from a nutritional point of view. So basically, there are three types of fatty acids. The first one is a saturated fatty acid, and that's basically a chemical structure. So the triglyceride is where the maximum number of hydrogens are attached to every carbon atom. Therefore, the fat is considered saturated with hydrogen atoms. A monounsaturated fatty acid is a triglyceride in which most of the fatty acids are monounsaturated. That means one fatty acid is missing a pair of hydrogen atoms in the middle of the chain. And then, of course, we have our polyunsaturated fatty acids, and those are a triglyceride where most of the fatty acids are polyunsaturated, and that means several hydrogen atom pairs are missing. And I think it'll make more sense when you see the chemical structure, which we'll see in the next slide, and that'll help you better understand what saturation means. But it's important to also note that when we look at a fat or an oil, they all have a combination of all the different fatty acids. It really depends on which one is more predominant that gives it the better qualities or the undesirable qualities. So at the top left is a saturated fatty acid. It's considered saturated because the carbon atom is attached to all the hydrogens it can handle. Saturated fat is found in red meat, butter, cheese, whole milk, coconut oil, and palm kernel oil. In the unsaturated fatty acid on the right, not all the carbon atoms are saturated with hydrogen atoms. Unsaturated fat may have one or more carbon double bonds, as you can see in the picture. So that's really the difference. I think this point will make even more sense as we go along in the chapter because, we use these terms all the time, and I think it's important to have that visual of, what it looks like chemically. Monounsaturated fatty acids contain one double bond, and polyunsaturated fatty acids contain more than one double bond. Vegetable oils are high in unsaturated fatty acids. You can see in the picture that on the left, the fat on the outside of your steak is solid. It stays solid at room temperature because it's extremely high in saturated fatty acids, which they're really packed tightly together. Vegetable oils, on the other hand, are liquid at room temperature because they're high in unsaturated fatty acids. So you can see that the bent chains of these fatty acids prevent tight packing, and that's why it allows the oil to flow. It's really important to understand this because eating too much saturated fatty acid, such as on the left, is really associated with heart disease. And, if we're talking about a class that deals with meal planning for more balanced eating, this is a point we will talk about the entire semester. And think about it. When we look at the chronic disease that we have in our country, cardiovascular disease is the number one killer. So it's important from a nutritional point of view to really understand oil so that we can cook, a little bit more healthy. Again, like I mentioned before, each fat you eat actually contains a mix of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fatty acids. But one type usually dominates. So I want you to refer to page 103 in your textbook, which gives you the fatty acid content of various fats. Here you can see, again, that all fats have a variety of fatty acids, and there's always one that dominates. For example, coconut oil, even though it's a plant-based product, it's about 90% saturated. 8% mono, and 2% polyunsaturated, compared to something like olive oil, which is really good, 18% saturated compared to 90 from coconut oil. And then also 68% monounsaturated compared to 8% for coconut oil, and 10% polyunsaturated. Olive oil contains the most monounsaturated fatty acids than any other fat. That's why we promote and really encourage people to use some oils over others when we're talking about heart health. Okay, let's break this apart a little bit. Now let's reiterate the foods that are high in saturated fat. They're mostly animal foods. So beef, especially well-marbled beef or the fat around the beef. Pork, such as sausages, franks, bacon. If you're eating something like a pork chop and you can, trim the fat around the edges and it's very lean, or if you're eating pork tenderloin, there's not a lot of fat and not a lot of saturated fat. So here I'm referring to the animal products that are generally higher in fat. Grain-based desserts such as cookies made with fat and eggs, those are higher in saturated fat. Many times it's hard to get away from that. It's not really a good cookie if it's made with oil. Whole milk and dairy products that are made with whole milk, such as cheeses and ice cream, those are very high in saturated fat. And because they're high in fat, they're also very high in calories. So again, from a healthy point of view, you should either eat less of those or have them less often. Or in the case of cheese, when you're a chef or a culinary professional, maybe use cheeses that are very pungent and have a wonderful flavor and that are very rich in flavor so that you don't have to use as much of them. Butter is very high in saturated fat. So when you use butter in cooking, it's best to use it as a finishing fat so that you add flavor to food instead of bathing your fat in butter while you're cooking. French fries, any kind of fried food, eggs, poultry skin, tropical oils such as coconut, palm kernel, and palm oil. Now we're going to refer to eggs again, and I don't want anyone to get the impression that eggs are on the no-no list because they're very, very good, and the egg white in general is very high in good quality protein. But as a general rule, these foods, if eaten in enough quantity, and if they take over more than 35% of our calories, can contribute to heart disease. All right, we talked about saturated fats. What about monounsaturated fats? Fats like olive oil, canola oil, peanut butter, avocados, olives, sesame oil, and sesame seeds. Also, tofu has some monounsaturated fat. So again, whether it's mono, poly, or saturated fat, it's important to remember it's all fat and it all contains 9 calories per gram. The type of predominant fatty acid just determines how heart healthy or how it affects your body. Then we also have foods that are high in polyunsaturated fat. Those are predominantly corn, soybean, sunflower oil, most of your nuts and seeds, and also fatty fish such as salmon, tuna, and sardines. And we're going to talk about the benefits of eating fatty fish in this chapter. So they're high in polyunsaturated fats. Again, it doesn't say that it's good or bad or indifferent. It just says that's what's in it. And again, we have to have a balance of the different kinds of saturated fatty acids in our diet. In addition to the 3 types of fatty acids, there's one more that's called trans fats, and that is actually short for trans fatty acids. Now, you've probably heard all the negativity surrounding trans fats, and it's very true. It's very important to keep our levels at 0, which can be very difficult if people are eating a lot of highly processed food. Now, first of all, where do they come from? They occur naturally at very low levels in meat and dairy. So if you're eating whole food and not a lot of processed foods where trans fats are actually created, you're not getting enough to really create harm in the body. But why is it important to understand trans fats? Well, they're contained naturally in food in a very small amount and not cause too much concern. But due to the hydrogenation process to make shortening and margarines and the amount that are used in our food supply, there is genuine concern. Since 2006, when food companies were required to label the amount of trans fats on nutrition fact labels, trans fats have been removed from any food. The FDA has taken steps to remove artificial trans fats in processed foods along the way. In 2015, the FDA determined that even partially hydrogenated oils, which is a major source of artificial trans fats in the food supply, are no longer generally recognized as safe. So, see, the government actually puts out a list. It's called the GRAS list, and that acronym stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. So there's a lot of different food on there, and they've taken hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oil off the safe list. They've extended the deadline where companies have to comply by replacing partially hydrogenated oil to January 1 of 2020. So basically, trans fats have been around quite a while, but the government, because of all the noted effects on heart disease, have really taken a look at and have really made steps to make food manufacturers, comply with taking trans fats out of our food chain. Now, let's drive this point home a little further. Hydrogenation, we mentioned that word before. Think about a vegetable oil in its liquid state at room temperature. Hydrogenation is when they add hydrogen to turn it into something solid, like shortening or margarine. So many of them are hydrogenated, and some are just partially hydrogenated. So oils that are partially hydrogenated contain trans fatty acids and also higher amounts of saturated fatty acids. And that's why there is a concern about its effects on health. Hydrogenation was created, the process was created to help products stay fresh longer and also give them a higher smoke point. It also makes them more spreadable. So you can see, just how this process came about and why it came about, because when people started eating more highly processed food after the Industrial Revolution, when they were really trying to, give products a higher shelf life, this was, a genius idea. But what has happened over the times, we've decided that based on studies and looking at how food affects our body and our health, have determined that the hydrogenation process in its effects of creating trans fats are no longer useful. In other words, the risk is affecting what we would normally consider a benefit. What foods contain trans fats? They can be found in some things like fried food, French fries and donuts, baked goods such as pastries and cookies, pie crust biscuits, canned biscuits, frozen pizza, ready-made frosting in a little can, some of the microwave popcorn, stick margarine, and shortening. So I really encourage you all to look at the nutrition facts labels. Trans fats have to be listed so you can see those. There's a number of these products now that don't contain trans fats because the FDA is requiring companies to remove it. So there's a chart, a really good chart on page 106 in your textbook, and it contains food sources with different types of fatty acids. So I hope that clarifies a little bit more about just what it is, where it's found, and the negativity surrounding trans fats in the diet. Now, the body can make most fatty acids that it needs, except for two, which are called essential fatty acids. So essential meaning it's important to get it from the diet because your body can't make it. These must be consumed in the diet: linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid. These are vital to our health and really help our immune system. For infants and children, they're needed for growth and development. So again, that's why it's important to put fat in its place and realize that it is necessary. But it's important to balance it out with the other foods in your diet and make sure you're getting the right amount. Optimum balance between omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids is very important. The current thinking is that there's probably a little too much omega-6 and not enough omega-3 in most American diets. The popularity of fried food and processed foods has caused us to consume more omega-6 fatty acids. So what are the foods that actually contain linoleic acid, which are called omega-6s? Vegetable oils, such as soybean, corn, sunflower, and then of course any margarine and salad oil that are made with these. And if you read the ingredient list of like almost all of the salad dressings out there and many of the margarines, these are primary vegetable oils that are used. So generally speaking, these foods contain linoleic acid, and we generally don't have a problem getting them in there in our diet. What are the foods with ALA, alpha-linolenic acid? These foods are the leading sources of omega-3s in our diet. We have canola oil, flaxseed, walnut oil, and then we have walnuts, ground flaxseed, and soy products. You may have heard at one time that omega-3s are very heart healthy. Actually, both omega-3 and 6 seem to protect heart health. The importance is balance. As you can see throughout the semester, that's really the name of the game when it comes to healthy eating, is it's important to know how much, how frequent, and how to combine foods for a healthy diet. So, what are the functions of these essential fatty acids, linoleic and alpha-linolenic? Well, they really contribute to the health of all of our body cells. They're very important for our immune system, to keep our body healthy. And then also for children and infants, it's extremely important for normal growth and development. So essential meaning they must be obtained from the diet. So as you can see, we have a lot of different things to cover when it comes to fat in general. Fat is just one of those nutrients that, again, because people are unsure of all the meanings, are very confused when they shop, are very confused when it comes time to cooking. And I want you to really understand all the different kinds of fat out there. And even though there's not going to be a slide for this next section, I really want you to think about fats that are used in your cooking. We're going to talk about each one and tell you a little bit about the benefits and also why you would choose the fats that you do, and not just because that's what you grabbed at the grocery store. Now, we have vegetable oils as fats in cooking. Vegetable oils are all liquid oils, and they almost all have the same caloric content. They're about 125 calories and 14 grams of fat per tablespoon. The most highly praised member of the family is actually olive oil. And you've heard that before, olives and olive oil and the Mediterranean diet, coming from the gold standard diet. It's about 77% monounsaturated fat. In taste test comparisons, with few exceptions, monounsaturated fats generally tend to be more flavorful than polyunsaturates. This factor is really important for the cook, who needs to create the greatest flavor from the minimum amount of fat. So it just goes to show that you would choose an oil or fat because of many reasons, but in the case of olive oil, it gives you such tremendous flavor. Now, some manufacturers are making blends from oils that are thought to be healthy, and some even have additives like vitamins, antioxidants, and other protective substances. But generally speaking, vegetable oils are liquid. They all have about the same number of calories. Now, when you look at the different kinds of oil, let's talk about olive. Let's talk about olive oil. Widely promoted as a heart-healthy monounsaturated fat, olive oil is always cholesterol-free and is the primary fat used in the Mediterranean cuisine. So, what I mentioned there is olive oil is always cholesterol-free. We'll talk more about cholesterol at the end of the chapter, but I want you to realize that it's not an animal product. Olives and olive oil do not contain cholesterol, and it really is a delicious, heart-healthy monounsaturated fat. Now, when you go to purchase an olive oil, it comes in different intensities of color, flavor, and also fruitiness. I've done some brown bag olive oil tastings with clients, and they range in earthiness and fruitfulness, and if you look at them, definitely color. Some have a very strong olive flavor, while some are very mild, and they can also be light in color and flavor. But from a nutritional perspective, calories per tablespoon remain the same. So when an olive oil is varied in color, flavor, fruitiness, or place of origin, it's generally always the same number of calories, about 125 calories and 14 grams of fat per tablespoon. When an olive oil is labeled refined, it means it's been filtered. It doesn't mean that the olives are top quality or the first pressing. It just means that the oil has been filtered. Olive oil is such an excellent choice for salad dressings, drizzles, marinades, and the smoke point is fairly low. So it's not a very good fat to use for frying. So, if you're trying to cook heart healthy or cook for someone who needs a healthy, heart healthy diet, it's important to realize that even though it's a very good choice for certain things, it's not a good kind of fat to use in deep frying. It may be perfectly fine to use when you're sauteing, but a very mild olive oil can be used in baking or when you want oil without a lot of flavor. So as you can see, there's just a lot of things to think about when we're talking about fats and oils, especially when it's used in cooking. So what about seed and nut oils? Oils like peanut, canola, almond, mustard seed, hazelnut oils, they're a lot like olive oil in that they're primarily monounsaturated. Oils such as safflower, sesame, sunflower, and walnut are very rich in polyunsaturated fats. Chinese peanut oil, dark sesame oil, macadamia nut oil, and walnut oils have very distinct nutty flavors. So as you can tell, a little bit goes a long way with impact when you use them. Then we have things like flax oil and wheat germ oil. They have really robust flavors, but are really heat sensitive and very fragile in chemical structure. So they're used as either a food supplement rather than a cooking ingredient, but they can be added to your finished dish in very small amounts. Okay, so we talked about olive oil, seed and nut oils. What about those tropical oils again? When we refer to things like tropical oils, we refer to coconut, palm, and also palm kernel oils. They're very unique in that they are vegetable, but they're very high in saturated fat. They're found in many processed foods because they increase the stability and shelf life and are relatively inexpensive. So the coconut, palm, and palm kernel oils are used a lot in cooking. Chefs should not be concerned about using small amounts of shredded coconut in cooking or as a garnish. It's not the same as when you deep fry a food in coconut oil. So, it's the same calorie and gram of fat per serving, but how it affects the cardiovascular system is another concern. So there's a lot of research that continues to be done on tropical oils. And if you Google it or if you do your research online, many times you'll see the praises of things like coconut palm and palm kernel oil. But for the sake of science and for the sake of the nutritional concepts of the course, it's important to consider that it is a highly saturated fat, and it's one best to save for moderate use and not use it as your primary oil in cooking. Okay, what about the canned vegetable oil sprays, as we sometimes call them non-stick sprays? Those non-stick vegetable oil cooking sprays are an excellent way to grease pans for cooking while using a minimal amount of fat, and that's why they're beneficial. Now, you can get it in a can, or you could even buy a fat mister where you put your favorite oil in a canister and use it as your own little vegetable oil spray. A light vegetable oil such as canola, safflower, corn can also be brushed onto the pan with a pastry brush or sprayed from one of those pump bottle sprays. That also works instead of using the nonstick spray. For those who have ecological concerns, since 1978, the aerosol manufacturers stopped using, it's called chlorofluorocarbon propellants, CFCs, which are thought to injure the ozone layer. So companies actually took that out. So this move was in compliance with the bans that were set by the EPA, and most commercial oil products that are spray use a hydrocarbon propellant, blending propane, isobutane, and also e-butane, all gases that are environmentally safe. All right, we talked about our oils. What about nuts? While nuts are high in fat, most are very heart-healthy monounsaturated fats. So when you eat those, they can actually help reduce cardiovascular risk and lower LDL cholesterol levels. But again, because they are high in fat, you don't want to eat a can of them. You want to make sure that you modify your portion to, let's say, a quarter of a cup serving. The Food and Drug Administration has also recognized the potential heart health benefits of nuts and actually allows a qualified health claim that states that most nuts may reduce the risk of heart disease. So nuts are really good and nuts are really healthy. Again, like anything, you have to balance out eating nuts with other foods. So again, portion control and how often you eat it is a really important consideration. But let's say you are dealing with a concern about not being able to gain weight and you need extra calories. But the type of fat that is contained in nuts is heart-healthy monounsaturated. So it's a very good choice to add to salads, to eat as a snack, to enhance any meal with creativity. What about butter? You know, everyone loves butter. Who doesn't love butter, especially a culinary professional? It's really considered the best tasting fat for both cooking and baking. Most chefs actually prefer unsalted butter because salt can always be added for flavor and also to improve shelf life. Butter is made from pasteurized sweet cream. It's considered an animal fat, and it contains cholesterol, 33 milligrams per tablespoon. It's a solid fat that contains saturated fat, which is about 7 grams a tablespoon. By law, the minimum fat content of butter is 80%. Now, if we're talking about premium or European-style butters, they have 82 to 88% fat. And the water content of all butter actually varies from 10 to 18%. Plus, there's generally about 2% milk solids. They also sell whipped butter that can be used as a spread. It spreads easier. And what it'll do is reduce the fat and calories per tablespoon, but it may not be reliable in cooking or baking. So, again, the way I like to look at butter, it's actually a luxury to be used in moderation and absolutely enjoyed. But, again, if I was cooking, let's say sauteing a piece of fish, I might saute it in a little bit of oil in a skillet and then just finish it off with some butter. Okay, that brings us to our margarine, which, has gotten a lot of bad rap. First of all, a French chemist invented margarine during the late 19th century as an inexpensive butter substitute. Margarine is really a blend of oils and solid fats that are heated and combined with water, milk and milk solids. There's emulsifying agents in there, flavorings, preservatives, coloring, and vitamins. Margarines are considered partially hydrogenated, and that's how they make it firm. They take the oil, hydrogenate it, and make it firm and spreadable. Solid or stick margarine looks like butter. So you can tell that hydrogenation depends on the hardness of the margarine. So the stick margarine would be less desirable than a soft tub margarine. Margarine is now under scrutiny. Along with other hydrogenated products because of the presence of those trans fatty acids. So again, margarine is a substitute, but it's always better to go back to the liquid at room temperature oils if you're looking for more heart-healthy fat to use in cooking. Then we have our soft or tub margarine. Those spreads contain water and air and only about 60% fat. So the calories are going to be lower. And then we also have diet imitation margarine, and those are reduced fat spreads that contain 40% fat and at least 50% water. These obviously are very unreliable for baking and cooking. But, it allows people to be able to use something and maybe use more of it than they generally would, wouldn't be able to because they wouldn't be getting as many calories. But when you think about it, soft tub margarine and also stick margarine really is not as appealing from a culinary point of view. Stick margarine has roughly the same fat content, approximately 80%, but it's lower in cholesterol. And some brands don't contain any cholesterol at all because the primary base ingredient for those is vegetable oil and not something like butter, which comes from an animal. So if you are choosing margarine, it's important to select one that has the first ingredient as liquid oil, which are higher in polyunsaturates, such as safflower oil. You want to try to avoid those products that have hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated as the first ingredient. There's several on the market now that also contain what we call plant stanols. These margarines are actually referred to as functional foods or nutraceuticals. That means that the foods have ingredients that are added for some type of health effect. In the case of margarine, many times they add plant stanols in the margarine, and they can really help to lower blood cholesterol levels if eaten regularly and in quite large quantities. So the concern for these nutraceuticals or functional foods or margarines that contain stanols, the thing to consider is if you use them as a therapeutic dose, they might be helpful. But if you're using them as a therapeutic product and the recommendations are to have 2 to 4 tablespoons a day, you can see how you might be adding quite a few extra calories to your meal. So those should be used upon recommendation from a registered dietitian so that you know exactly what you're getting. Okay, so that's enough about margarine. How about solid shortening? Most shortening is made of highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils and contain about half of the saturated fat of butter. Solid shortening is designed to go into food, not put it on your food, because it really doesn't have a good taste or a good mouthfeel. And it also contains a generous quantity of emulsifiers to actually preserve the suspension of the fat in the liquid. to hold more air and also to stabilize the moisture content of the batter. One popular shortening contains 80% liquid soybean oil that's actually suspended in a honeycomb matrix of 20% hardened or hydrogenated oil. It's about 100% fat, contains no water, and has a high level of emulsifiers added to stabilize the structure of baked goods and also to increase the absorption of moisture. So you can see a lot of these products were developed to really have a better outcome in some of your baked goods. It's just like lard or bacon fat. Lard is actually the rendered pork fat, and sometimes it has a small amount of water in it. It's 100% animal fat and has about 14 milligrams of cholesterol per tablespoon. So it's very, very highly saturated fat, 39.2%. Bacon grease, on the other hand, is a fat that's released when bacon is cooked. It can be used in small amounts to add distinct flavor, but it's nutritionally similar to lard. The downside is it also contains more sodium. Bacon fat, like lard, has slightly more unsaturated fat than saturated. Still consider 40% saturated fat. 1 tablespoon of bacon fat has about 115 calories. Plus, like I mentioned, it also has sodium. So a lot of things to talk about when we're referring to the fats and oils. Cream and sour cream comes under the heading of cream, and they're really grouped by fat content. So if we're using heavy cream, or what we sometimes call whipping cream, that means that the product has 36% milk fat. If it's light whipping cream, it's going to have 30 to 36% milk fat. Light cream has about 18 to 30% fat, and half has 10 to 18. Now there's 2 exceptions to the regulations, and those are your fat-free half and whipping cream in squirt cans. The fat-free half is usually a blend of non-fat milk, sweeteners, thickeners, artificial colors and flavors, preservatives, and even sometimes added vitamins. And then, of course, your squirt can whipped cream can have a lot of different varying amounts of fat. Some don't even have any fat at all. Last but not least is our sour cream. And sour cream is generally light cream that's soured with lactic acid bacteria, and then it's homogenized until it's smooth and also pasteurized. There is such a thing as light sour cream, which has a reduced fat content, and then a no-fat cream, which is an emulsion of non-fat milk solids, thickeners, and stablers. And when I think about how we can utilize sour cream in our cooking, sometimes a better substitution would be Greek-style yogurt, plain unflavored yogurt, or also some silken tofu. So, as you can see, there's a lot to learn when it comes to the fats and the fatty acids. But we have to go one step further and actually look at the functions